Hello everyone and welcome back! As a reminder, since I have been gone for a few months, my name's Skeptical Vision. All jokes aside though, I am actually very sorry for my extended absence. This came as a result of being quite busy with school, among many other things, which resulted in very little time for me to script, record, and edit any videos for YouTube. Due to the small amount of time that I had available, I simply chose to take a break until I felt like returning. From now on, however, I will try my hardest to make some time for YouTube since I do actually quite enjoy making these videos. But before we start, I would appreciate it greatly if y'all could tap that subscribe button and ring that beautiful notification bell so that you will be notified of the next time that I upload a video, which I assure you will happen eventually. Now today I will be once again heading into the tech world, but with a particular focus on one of its players. Now, I am aware that many of you may have heard of this relatively unknown company, but I assure you that you will quite enjoy learning about them. Now, what company am I talking about? You may ask because for some reason you clicked on the video without reading the title. Well, I'm talking about the itty-bitty tech giant Apple Incorporated. Now, in this video, I will be going through the entire history of Apple from past to present, from inception to today. In the interest of time, I will be concentrating mostly on landmark events, products, milestones, among others, as opposed to following the timeline for every little thing. For example, I will cover launches of products, but I will not cover every single refresh of the product unless warranted. Of course, I will not only cover the timeline of product launches, but also important dates for the business side of Apple. Hopefully, the balance that I've struck will satisfy both those interested in the history of Apple tech and those interested in the business aspect of one of today's largest companies. From looking at Apple's history, it is clear that their timeline can be separated into four eras: the early years, the Jobs-less years, the Jobs era, and the post-Jobs era. It is through these four eras that we will be exploring the Apple timeline. With all that out of the way, let's jump right into the entire history of Apple. As many of us know, Apple Computers Incorporated was founded by the famous duo of Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. However, let's look further into the events surrounding the inception and the company's primordial years. First of all, Jobs and Wozniak, both of whom were college dropouts, would foster a friendship and partnership throughout the 1970s, which culminated in the pair looking into creating and selling their own computers in the market. Both of the men had a very deep interest in the computer technology that was expanding rapidly at the time, especially Wozniak, who had already begun designing computers on paper in anticipation of the day where he would have the resources to veritably do so. All this greatly benefited from the fact that the two had the good fortune of living in the high-tech hotbed of Silicon Valley situated in California. It was Jobs who was responsible for acquiring the means of producing the computers via an agreement with a small retailer to sell that very computer, the Apple I, along with securing a $250,000 loan worth approximately $1,623,956.19 in 2018 from investor Mike Markula, who would also join the Steve duo to officially form Apple Computer Inc. on April 1st, 1976, making Apple the most financially successful April Fool's prank of all time. I do have to interject really quickly and add that there's also a fourth founder of Apple named Ronald Wayne, who had come on to help Wozniak and Jobs with some administrative duties as well as helping construct some of the new computers himself. However, 12 days after the company had incorporated, he sold his 10% share of the company back to Jobs and Wozniak for $800 American, and unfortunately for him, that would be worth close to $100 billion today, which would make him the second richest man in the world. However, hindsight being 2020, he did make this tremendous mistake, and that's very unfortunate for him. However, let's get back to our regularly scheduled programming. Now, for those of you who don't know why the name Apple was chosen, it's actually quite interesting. Jobs got the name during one of his fruitarian diets, one of the many diets and fads that Jobs would partake in during his life. Liking the name because it was, quote, fun-spirited and not intimidating, close quote, he presented the name to Wozniak, who also liked the name. However, one aspect that cannot be forgotten is the fact that Apple would come before Jobs' and Wozniak's previous employer, Atari, in the phone book. The choosing of the brand name, as well as being the designer of the renowned rainbow Apple logo, would be the first steps for Steve Jobs in particular to create the world-famous Apple brand. As we continue on our journey through the early years at Apple, let's move on to the years that would see Apple computers explode onto the market and become a massive player in the computing world. Not too long after Apple had signed to have the Apple I produced, work would begin on the next installment, the Apple II. Thanks to the money from the sales of the Apple I, the horizons expanded for the creation of the Apple II, and thus led to many improved features and much better ease of use over its predecessor. The biggest of which would be the display and graphics capability of the Apple II. A refresh would even add color later down the line. This groundbreaking product would first be introduced to the public at a computer exposition in April 1977 and would be released for sale later in the year. The launch was a massive success for Apple, leading to millions of sales across its lifetime, which led well into the 1980s. In the years following, a couple of events occurred for Apple, though none of them necessitating much detail. The first of which being the release of the Apple III, which was unable to live up to the hype of its predecessor, and suffered notable issues when it came to overheating, which led to a large recall. The second notable event would be Apple's IPO, or initial public offering, in late 1980, which would be the largest IPO at the time since Ford, and which gave Apple an initial stock price of approximately $22. Now, despite a couple of setbacks in the form of Steve Wozniak's departure in 1983 and IBM overtaking Apple with their IBM PC in the early 80s, there was something big looming over at Apple: the Macintosh. This groundbreaking product, whose line of products still lives on to this day, would first be introduced by the iconic Super Bowl commercial that we've all seen that emphasizes Macintosh's willingness to break from the norm and to think different. The ad, along with the rest of a massive ad campaign, helped drive mass attention towards the device. At this point, you may be asking yourself, what made the Macintosh so special anyways? The answer lies in its innovative GUI, or graphical user interface, which was never before seen in the world of computers, as they had previously all relied on text entry for complete operation of the machine. This innovation would change the way operating systems would be developed and led to today, where GUIs are everywhere and text-based operating systems are a thing of the past. Unfortunately for Apple, the Macintosh would be the last big product launch before the last founder, and who many had seen as the face of the company, Steve Jobs, would be booted from the corporation altogether in 1985. This departure was mainly due to the massive schism that had been growing between Jobs and Apple's president and CEO, John Sculley. The schism was based primarily on each's differing views on Apple's future and where it should focus its attention. Jobs would go on to form another company named Next, while Apple would continue to fight against IBM and another upstart, Microsoft. As it turns out, the departure of Jobs would start on Apple a downward spiral that would last into the late 1990s. As previously mentioned, Apple was struggling to compete with the other computer manufacturers at the time. The company that would quickly rise atop the pile of opponents would be the aforementioned Microsoft. Their operating systems would be a massive force behind this, with such successes such as MS-DOS, perhaps the most successful command line operating system of all time, and their now famous Windows line that included notable iterations such as Windows 95. Apple was having so much trouble competing that it would often result in half-baked products and marketing campaigns. A confusing lineup of many different Macs with little differentiation, as well as poor advertising, led to Apple being named one of the most poorly managed companies at the time. During this time, Apple's stock price would hit lows of under $1, including a plunge to around 40 cents in late 1997. The 90s would also mark an odd time for Apple, with the release of many failed products such as the Newton, a handheld personal assistant, the Macintosh TV, a product which sought to combine the TV and computer experience, and finally the Pippin, an Apple gaming console. In a desperate attempt to climb out of the hole that they found themselves in, Apple bought out the computer company Next in 1997, which, as we all remember, was being run by good old Steve Jobs after being run out of town approximately 12 years prior. This would end up being one of, if not the, best acquisitions of all time, not just for Apple, but for any corporation in general. The deal not only gave Jobs his jobs back at Apple, but also gave Apple access to Next operating system, which would become the foundation of Mac OS X, which is still being used today, having been updated numerous times of course. So, I must say, good jobs Apple, you did well. Jobs' presence would quickly come into effect soon after, once he was installed as interim CEO after the ousting of Jill Amelio by the board of directors. While he was technically only supposed to be interim, to be replaced by someone else later, his rapid success led him to stay in the position until 2011, due to health concerns that we will talk about later. One of the most interesting things that occurred during his tenure would happen within his first year back, when he was able to secure an investment from Microsoft, of all companies, as well as a commitment to release MS Office on Mac, in exchange for Apple dropping some lawsuits, as well as making Internet Explorer the default browser for Mac. And if you've ever used Internet Explorer, you know how desperate Apple must have been to allow that abysmal disgrace of a browser to be the default choice. Moving on, in the new millennium, under the direction of Steve, Apple would release multiple products which helped rebuild their brand and regrow the following they had previously experienced. On the computing side, Apple released a fan-favorite iMac and iBook, both of whom came equipped with the brand new Mac OS X. All of these gave a glimpse into the future of Apple computing, with the iMac line of all-in-one computers still around today, the iBook, which was Apple's first foray into laptops and was the predecessor to the MacBooks, and finally Mac OS X, which is still Mac's operating system to this day, which, as I've said before, has since been updated many times. Of course, perhaps the biggest driver of the initial Apple comeback was the introduction of the insanely popular iPod and its accompanying iTunes software. The first iPod was introduced in October 2001 and would go on to live a long life as the world's most successful and well-known MP3 player. Over its lifetime, Apple would introduce 5 different iPods. The original iPod, which would later be released under the name iPod Classic, the Shuffle, the Mini, the Nano, and the iPod Touch. As previously mentioned, alongside the iPod, Apple also released iTunes, a software program which I'm sure you've used in the past to store and purchase your music across multiple devices. And in case you were wondering, as of today, only the iPod Touch technically remains in production, though the current model has not been updated since 2015. These products allowed Apple to regain financial stability and set them up for their upcoming products whom we can all recognize. The first of these would be the MacBook, which would take over from the iBook and expand into 3 separate lines: the MacBook Pro for power users, the MacBook Air for those wanting a thin and light laptop, and just the plain old MacBook itself. Even bigger than the MacBook, however, was the introduction of the one and only iPhone. In a now famous presentation, Steve Jobs introduced the phone that would change the entire landscape forever. With its revolutionary touchscreen display, the iPhone, sporting the brand new iOS, would transform the way mobile phones would be used forever. While many scoffed at Apple and the iPhone initially, within a few short years it was clear that this was the way of the future. One after the other, BlackBerry, Nokia, Microsoft would all come to regret their underestimations of Apple. While Apple would continue chugging along for the next couple of years thanks to the grand success of the iPhone, a big change occurred on August 24th, 2011, when Steve Jobs would step down as CEO of the company due to health concerns, to be replaced by Tim Cook. An even bigger shock materialized on October 5th, 2011, when Steve Jobs would pass away. His passing caused a great amount of grief for Apple fans worldwide. Despite the sadness, however, many rallied to celebrate the life of one of the largest shapers of our modern-day tech-driven lives. As we near present day, Apple continued to release iterations of its beloved Mac and iPhone devices, as well as releasing new products to add to their product mix, most notably the iPad and the Apple Watch. They have also released new services such as Apple Music. These services are a notable area of expansion in the last few years for Apple. Thanks to these highly successful products and services, Apple has been able to greatly increase its worth and was able to attain the lofty height of a company valuation of over $1 trillion in early August of 2018, with shares reaching a height of $233.47 each. The remarkable achievement of having a value of $1 trillion made Apple the first American company to achieve the feat. And while they have since slipped, it would be to no surprise to anyone if they were able to regain such a lofty position. In the coming years, I'm sure I won't be the only one waiting in anticipation to see what Apple will do next. Whether it be another great groundbreaking product as we've seen many times before, or their continued expansion into online services, Apple is sure to continue to expand and innovate in the years ahead. If nothing else, Apple's large amount of cash points to their ability to continue funding their innovation into the far future. Alrighty, thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate you guys joining me on this journey through the entire history of Apple. If you liked the video, feel free to hit that thumbs up button. If you disliked the video, you can hit that dislike button. If you have anything to say, go ahead and leave a comment. Until next time, guys, see you later.